Case 1, Nathan Sutherland. A woman who had lived in a care facility since the age of 3 gave birth on the 29th of December, 2018. She could not speak. She could not walk. She required total care for every function of daily life. Not one member of the facility staff had known she was pregnant. That birth set off a criminal investigation that would ultimately result in a DNA match, a felony conviction, a 10-year prison sentence, and legislation that changed how Arizona licenses long-term care facilities. Nathan Sutherland was a licensed practical nurse employed at Hacienda Healthcare, an intermediate care facility in Phoenix that served individuals with significant intellectual and developmental disabilities. Sutherland had worked at the facility since approximately 2011. According to court records, he was among the staff responsible for the woman's daily care, and he had provided that care on hundreds of occasions between 2012 and 2018. The patient had come to Hacienda as a child of 3 years old. She was originally from the San Carlos Apache Indian Reservation. Her disabilities were profound and her care needs were total. She was entirely dependent on the people employed to care for her. On the 29th of December 2018, a staff member entered her room and discovered she was in labor. Staff called 911. Phoenix Fire Department personnel responded, and the patient was transported to a hospital where she gave birth. The Phoenix Police Department opened a criminal investigation the same day. The central investigative tool in this case was DNA analysis. Detectives moved quickly. They knew that whoever had caused the pregnancy had access to the patient, and that access was limited to staff. Investigators obtained a DNA profile from the newborn. They then began collecting DNA samples from every male employee who had access to the patient's unit. This was a methodical, documented process, and it required coordination between the police department, the facility, and the court system. Sutherland did not immediately comply with the request for a DNA sample. Investigators sought and obtained a court order compelling him to provide one. The Phoenix Police Department's crime laboratory then compared his DNA profile against the profile developed from the newborn. On the 22nd of January 2019, less than 4 weeks after the birth, the laboratory reported a confirmed match. Sutherland was arrested that same day. He was charged with 1 count of sexual assault and 1 count of abuse of a vulnerable adult. 2 days later, on the 24th of January, he surrendered his Arizona nursing license. Court documents placed the assault that led to the pregnancy as having occurred between February and April of 2018. The investigation established that Sutherland had had regular, unsupervised access to the patient during that window. The case moved through the court system over the following years. In September of 2021, Sutherland entered a guilty plea on both counts, sexual assault and abuse of a vulnerable adult. Superior Court Judge Margaret LaBianca presided over the sentencing hearing. She sentenced Sutherland to the maximum term available under the plea agreement, 10 years in the Arizona Department of Corrections, to be followed by lifetime supervised probation. He was ordered to register as a sex offender for the remainder of his life. The court credited him with 1,044 days already served in pretrial custody. At the sentencing hearing, Judge LaBianca addressed the nature of the offense directly. She stated that it was hard to imagine a more vulnerable adult than the victim in this case, and that Sutherland had exploited his position of trust as a caregiver to commit the offense. The institutional fallout from the case extended well beyond the criminal conviction. William Timmons, the chief executive of Hacienda Healthcare, resigned. Governor Doug Ducey publicly called for the resignation of the facility's board of directors. State health regulators subsequently moved to revoke Hacienda's operating license, citing negligence. 2 civil proceedings produced significant financial outcomes. The family of the victim reached a settlement of $15 million against the estate of Dr. Philip Gear Jr., who had served as the woman's physician for 26 years. In that civil matter, Judge Theodore Campagnolo found that the doctor's care had fallen below the standard of care because he had failed to diagnose the pregnancy. The state of Arizona reached a separate civil settlement for $7.5 million. The most lasting consequence of this case was legislative. Before 2019, Hacienda and facilities like it had operated for decades without state licensing or inspection because Arizona law had included a specific exemption for privately operated intermediate care facilities. That exemption had existed for more than 2 decades. Lawmakers reversed it in 2019. Governor Ducey signed the legislation into law. From that point forward, all such facilities in Arizona were required to obtain state licenses and submit to state inspections. A single 911 call on the 29th of December 2018 ultimately reached the floor of the Arizona legislature and changed the law. Before we move to case 2, take a second to like this video. It tells our algorithm to share this content with people who care about patient safety and accountability journalism. Now, let's continue. Case 2, Danielle Lynn Langham, a registered nurse working at a surgery center in Scottsdale, was removing narcotic medications from patient vials and replacing the contents with sterile saline. Patients scheduled to receive pain management during surgical procedures were, according to investigators, receiving an inert saline solution instead. The scheme continued, according to the indictment, for approximately 9 months. Danielle Lynn Langham was a registered nurse employed at a surgery center in Scottsdale, Arizona. According to the Arizona Attorney General's office, between August of 2015 and May of 2016, Langham tampered with vials of fentanyl and Dilaudid, two controlled narcotic substances that were maintained at the surgery center for patient care. The method investigators described as one that has appeared in drug diversion cases in healthcare facilities across the country. The diverting nurse removes the narcotic contents of a sealed or partially used vial. The vial is then refilled with sterile saline, a clear, odorless liquid that is visually indistinguishable from the original medication. The vial is returned to storage. On paper and in physical appearance, the supply appears intact. The consequences of this method operate on 2 levels simultaneously. The first involves the diverting employee, who is misusing a controlled substance. The second involves the patients, who are scheduled to receive that substance as part of their care. When a saline-substituted vial is administered, the patient does not receive the intended medication. The investigative process in drug diversion cases in healthcare settings typically begins with controlled substance inventory reconciliation. Every vial of a scheduled narcotic that enters a facility is tracked from the moment it arrives from the pharmacy. The pharmacy documents what was dispensed. Nursing records document what was administered and to which patient. At the end of an accounting period, reconciliation means comparing what was dispensed, what was documented as given, and what physically remains in storage. A discrepancy between any of those 3 numbers is a red flag that triggers a review. Investigators at the surgery center identified discrepancies that pointed toward Langham. The inquiry expanded, and the matter was referred to the Arizona Attorney General's office for prosecution. Langham surrendered her Arizona registered nursing license on the 2nd of May, 2017. The surrender of a license in the context of an active investigation is a significant administrative step. It removes the individual from practice immediately, before any criminal conviction is entered. On the 26th of June, 2018, Attorney General Mark Brnovich announced that a state grand jury had returned an indictment against Langham on 3 separate drug diversion-related offenses. A state grand jury indictment means that a panel of citizens reviewed the evidence presented by prosecutors and found probable cause to believe that each charged offense had been committed. 23 counts represents the scope of the alleged conduct over the 9-month window described in the investigation. The Arizona Attorney General's office is the primary prosecutorial body for healthcare-related drug diversion cases in Arizona. The office investigates and prosecutes these cases in coordination with the Arizona State Board of Pharmacy, the Arizona State Board of Nursing, and, where federal controlled substances are involved, the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration. We are precise about the record in this case. The public documentation confirms the indictment, 23 counts, the surrender of the nursing license, and the identity of the investigating body. The final disposition of the criminal case was not confirmed in the public record available for this documentary. This is not unusual for cases that are resolved through plea agreements and sealed final orders, or where court records have not been digitized in a searchable format. We present this case as it is documented. A grand jury indictment on 23 counts, following a 9-month window of alleged diversion at a Scottsdale surgical facility. What this case contributes to the broader record is an understanding of how diversion operates, how it is detected, and what systems exist to prevent it. Automated dispensing cabinets, which log each access by employee badge number and timestamp, have become standard in hospital settings because they create an audit trail that manual inventory systems could not. Witnessed waste procedures, in which a second nurse co-signs documentation when any portion of a controlled substance is discarded, are another control mechanism. Reconciliation software that flags access patterns inconsistent with patient care needs is now a standard component of pharmacy management systems in Arizona and nationally. When those systems are weak, inconsistent, or not enforced, diversion can continue for months. The alleged timeline here, August of 2015 through May of 2016, is consistent with diversion that continued until audit procedures caught it. Case 3, Dulce Cervantes Sanchez, registered nurse who worked in hospital emergency medicine, was, at the same time, visiting a patient's home multiple times each week. Over the course of approximately 19 months, that nurse received between $32,000 and $48,000 from the patient, most of it in cash. The investigation was not conducted by police. It was conducted by a state licensing board, and the evidence it assembled was conclusive. Dulce Cervantes Sanchez held a registered nurse license in Arizona. Her primary employment was at Dignity Health's Arizona General Hospital in Levine, where she worked in the emergency department. She also contracted with mobile intravenous hydration companies, which provide at-home or concierge-for services to clients seeking hydration therapy. Through her mobile IV work, Cervantes Sanchez began treating a 56-year-old woman in Tonopah, a rural community west of Phoenix in Maricopa County. In the Board of Nursing's formal findings, the patient is identified as patient TL. The professional relationship began in March of 2022. According to the Arizona State Board of Nursing's findings of fact, the conduct continued through October of 2023, a period of approximately 19 months. During that time, the board found that Cervantes Sanchez received between $32,000 and $48,000 from patient TL, the majority in cash. Investigators documented a pattern of conduct that went well beyond the boundaries of a professional nursing relationship. The board's findings describe the nurse visiting the patient's home several times per week. They document that the nurse discussed her own personal and financial problems with the patient during those visits. The findings include text messages in which the nurse asked the patient for money in amounts of several $100s at a time. The board found that the relationship had been reframed over time from a professional care relationship to one in which the nurse was asking the patient for repeated financial assistance. The investigation was conducted by the Arizona State Board of Nursing. Board investigators gathered financial records and bank documentation. They recovered text message communications between the nurse and the patient. They contacted each of the mobile IV hydration companies that Cervantes Sanchez claimed to represent and requested records of services provided to patient TL. A key finding emerged from that records request. According to board investigators, between June of 2022 and July of 2023, a 13-month period within the overall timeline, Cervantes Sanchez had not charted any of the infusions she claimed to be providing. The IV hydration companies she identified had no records of services rendered to patient TL and no records of payments processed through them during that period. That gap between the nurse's claimed activity and the documented record was central to the board's findings. The board also raised a concern separate from the financial conduct. Investigators noted that the pattern of visits and the documented statements raised questions about whether the patient had been properly informed of the nature of the relationship and about the circumstances surrounding some of the interactions. At a special meeting of the Arizona State Board of Nursing in July of 2024, two board officials testified and presented findings. Emma Mamalou, the board's chief counsel, characterized the conduct as not a one-time mistake or a single lapse in judgment. She described it as an extensive, prolonged boundary violation and financial exploitation that had continued across nearly 2 years. Tiffany Fotinos, a board investigator, testified specifically about the absence of any company records that could corroborate the nurse's account of the services she claimed to be providing. Cervantes Sanchez appeared and made a statement during the board proceedings. In that statement, as recorded, she acknowledged having taken advantage of the patient. She stated that she should not have blurred the line between a professional relationship and a friendship, and that she should not have asked her patient for financial help. Following the hearing, the Arizona State Board of Nursing suspended her registered nursing license. This case is significant because it demonstrates a category of patient harm that does not involve physical injury and does not move through the criminal court system, at least not as the primary enforcement mechanism. Financial exploitation of a patient by a nurse is a violation of professional conduct standards, a breach of the nurse-patient relationship, and, in many circumstances, a criminal matter as well. But the licensing board operates as a parallel accountability system with its own investigative tools and its own enforcement authority. The board can compel production of records, hear testimony, and impose sanctions including suspension and revocation of the license that permits a nurse to practice. In this case, it was the board not a prosecutor, that assembled the documented record and imposed the consequence. Case 4, Christine Muturi. She had never held a nursing license, not in Arizona, not in Nevada, not in any state in the country. But in August of 2025, she was hired as a registered nurse, given access to vulnerable patients in a hospice facility, and sent on solo patient visits. The way she was caught came down to one number on a piece of paper and a date that made the math impossible. Christine Nyambura Muturi, also known as Christine Lewis, was 41 years old and a resident of Mesa, Arizona. In August of 2025, she submitted an employment application to Northern Arizona Hospice, a hospice provider based in Cottonwood, Arizona. On that application, she presented herself as a registered nurse with more than 4 years of hospice experience. She described prior work as a triage nurse at a hospital in Las Vegas, Nevada, between 2019 and 2022. To substantiate her credentials, she provided a Colorado nursing license number and represented that the license was valid for multi-state practice under the Nurse Licensure Compact. Northern Arizona Hospice hired her. On the 15th of August, 2025, Muturi conducted a solo patient visit under her stated credentials. After that visit, administrators at Northern Arizona Hospice conducted a more detailed review of the nursing license she had submitted. What they found was a fundamental discrepancy. The Colorado license number Muturi had provided was real, but it belonged to a different registered nurse. That nurse shared Muturi's first and last name. The critical detail was the date of license issuance. The license had been issued in 1980. Muturi was born in 1984. The license had been issued 4 years before she was born. When administrators confronted her with this information, Muturi resigned from Northern Arizona Hospice. She then applied for and obtained a position at Golden Rose Hospice in Mesa. Northern Arizona Hospice filed a report with the Cottonwood Police Department. When the medical director at Golden Rose learned of the circumstances surrounding her prior employment, that director contacted the Arizona Board of Nursing directly. The board conducted its own search and could not locate any valid nursing license issued to Christine Muturi anywhere in the United States. The Arizona Attorney General's office took over the investigation. Investigators confirmed through database searches across multiple states that Muturi had never been licensed as a registered nurse in Arizona, Nevada, or any other jurisdiction. The case then moved into an undercover investigative phase. On the 13th of November 2025, a special agent from the Attorney General's office, working undercover, arranged a meeting with Muturi under the pretext of needing a registered nurse for a new hospice operation the agent was preparing to open. During that meeting, Muturi again stated that she held a valid nursing license. That statement, made to an agent of the state, provided probable cause for her arrest. She was taken into custody at her Mesa residence. Muturi was charged with multiple felonies. The charges included forgery, fraudulent schemes and artifices, taking the identity of another person, and unlicensed practice of nursing using a fraudulent credential. At her initial appearance, the court denied bail. Muturi was a convicted felon on supervised release at the time of her arrest, with prior law enforcement contacts, including a domestic battery arrest in Las Vegas and a fugitive from justice matter originating in Los Angeles. Reporting on her background also noted prior fraud-related allegations in Kenya involving an unaccredited educational institution she had been associated with. The Nurse Licensure Compact is a multi-state agreement that allows nurses who hold a license in their home state to practice in other compact states without obtaining separate licenses. The compact is designed to facilitate the movement of nursing professionals and to address staffing needs across state lines. What it requires as a foundational matter is that the underlying home state license be genuine, active, and in good standing. The compact creates a record-sharing framework, but that framework depends on accurate initial data. Muturi's scheme exploited the assumption that a license number that returns a result in a database search is a valid license held by the person presenting it. The single most direct check that exposed the fraud was a comparison of dates, the license issuance year against the applicant's birth year. An employer who cross-references those two data points against publicly available nursing board records would have identified the problem immediately. This case has prompted renewed attention across Arizona's hospice and home care sector regarding the protocols employers use for primary source verification, the process of confirming a nurse's credentials directly with the issuing licensing board rather than relying solely on what an applicant provides. Case 5. Pamela Ogwen. She was treating patients, writing prescriptions, and presenting herself as a licensed medical professional. She worked at a wellness center in Arizona during the period of the coronavirus pandemic. She was not a nurse practitioner. She was not a registered nurse. She had never held a professional nursing license of any kind. The investigation that exposed her began not in a healthcare setting, but in a family courtroom. Pamela Ogwyn was 58 years old and a resident of Arizona. According to the Arizona Attorney General's office, Ogwyn operated under the name Dr. Pamela Robinson. She was employed at a wellness center located in Youngtown, Arizona. During her time there, she treated patients and wrote prescriptions, including prescriptions for controlled substances, medications that, under Arizona and federal law, can only be prescribed by individuals who hold specific, verified professional credentials. Ogwyn held none of those credentials. She had never been licensed as a registered nurse, an advanced practice registered nurse, or a nurse practitioner in Arizona, in any other state, or at any point in her life. The investigation into Ogwyn did not begin because a patient complained, and it did not begin because a pharmacist flagged a suspicious prescription. It began because Ogwyn made a statement in a child custody proceeding. According to the Attorney General's office, the Arizona State Board of Nursing opened its investigation after Ogwyn, appearing in a family court hearing, falsely represented herself as a licensed medical professional who was providing services to one of the parties in that case. A statement made under oath in a legal proceeding is subject to verification. When the board searched its licensing records for Ogwyn's credentials, it found none. The investigation then expanded. Public records indicate that Ogwyn had applied for advanced practice certification in Arizona using personal information that had been taken from a licensed professional in Maine. In March of 2021, the Arizona State Board of Nursing issued a letter to Ogwyn documenting its findings. The letter stated that Ogwyn, while presenting herself as a nurse practitioner, had written prescriptions for controlled substances for multiple patients. The case moved from the licensing board to the criminal courts. Ogwyn was charged with fraudulent schemes and artifices, taking the identity of another person, and forgery. She was convicted on all three categories of offense. Prosecutors and defense counsel reached a plea agreement, under which several additional felony charges were dismissed in exchange for her guilty plea. The Attorney General's office announced the sentence, 5 years in Arizona State Prison. The investigative thread that runs through this case is the intersection of identity verification and cross-agency information sharing. The initial fraud was made visible because Ogwyn made a false claim in a legal proceeding, a setting where statements can be checked against official records. The identity she used in her credential applications was traceable because it belonged to a real person in another state whose information could be compared against Ogwyn's. The connection between the family court proceeding, the Board of Nursing, and the Attorney General's office illustrates the way Arizona's public accountability systems can intersect when someone attempts to operate under false credentials across multiple institutional settings. The Arizona State Board of Nursing maintains a publicly accessible registry of individuals it has identified as nurse imposters, people who have represented themselves as licensed nurses without holding valid credentials. That registry is a direct preventive response to cases like Ogwyn's. It exists so that employers, patients, and the public can search for names that have been flagged, independent of whether a criminal prosecution is active. Drug enforcement is a dimension of this case that deserves specific attention. The controlled substances Ogwyn prescribed were subject to federal and state scheduling requirements. Every prescription for a scheduled substance is required to originate from a licensed prescriber with a valid DEA registration number. Prescriptions Ogwyn wrote under a fraudulent identity could have reached patients without any pharmacist being positioned to detect the irregularity because the false license number might return a valid result in a superficial check. The deeper cross-check, confirming that the DEA number matched the prescriber's verified identity, is the layer that would have caught it. If this level of documented investigation is what you're looking for, please leave a comment and let us know. And subscribe so you are there when the next episode drops. Case 6, Jad Gabriel Sarah, a nursing supervisor at a hospital in Tucson, called 911. She reported that a member of her staff had committed an offense against a patient in the emergency department. There was camera footage. There was a statement from the defendant, and within months there was a guilty plea. The case moved from arrest to conviction in under 4 months. Jad Gabriel Sarah was 48 years old and worked as a registered nurse in the emergency department of Banner University Medical Center in Tucson, Arizona. On the 4th of February, 2026, Tucson Police Department officers were dispatched to the hospital in response to a 911 call from a nursing supervisor. The supervisor reported that a nurse employed at the facility had committed a sexual offense against a patient who was receiving care in the emergency department. The patient had been admitted to the emergency department because of seizures. Her medical condition at the time of the offense meant that she was incapacitated. Her neurological symptoms and the medications administered for her care had left her without the ability to respond or resist. She was unable to protect herself. The investigative approach in this case combined three distinct categories of evidence. The first was the report from the supervisor, a mandatory reporter acting under Arizona's statutory requirement that healthcare institutions report conduct that poses a danger to patients. The second was surveillance camera footage. Banner University Medical Center, like most large hospital systems, maintains camera coverage of hallways and areas near specialized medical equipment. According to the interim complaint filed with the court, Sarah was observed on camera entering the patient's room under a stated pretext related to an imaging procedure. The camera footage documented the sequence of events in the room. The third category of evidence was a statement from Sarah himself. After being advised of his constitutional rights by Tucson police investigators, he made admissions to the officers. He stated that he had made a serious mistake and that he did not know why he had done it. Sarah was booked into custody on the 4th of February 2026. He was charged with sexual abuse, aggravated assault, and abuse of a vulnerable adult. At his initial court appearance, a judge set bond at $50,000. He was placed on administrative leave by the hospital. The case was resolved through a guilty plea. Sarah pleaded guilty to one count of sexual abuse. On the 28th of May 2026, Pima County Superior Court Judge Howard Fell presided over the sentencing hearing. The sentence imposed was 30 days in the Pima County Adult Detention Complex, 3 years of supervised probation, and 50 hours of community service. The court also ordered Sarah to register as a sex offender under Arizona law. He was given no credit for time previously served and was directed to report to the detention complex on the 12th of June, 2026. The sentence in this case has been the subject of significant public commentary because of the disparity between the nature of the offense and the term of incarceration imposed. The sentencing decision was made by the court in accordance with the terms of the plea agreement reached between the prosecution and the defense. We document it here as the court record reflects it. Two institutional dimensions of this case are significant for the broader understanding of patient safety in hospital settings. The first is the role of the mandatory reporter. Arizona law requires healthcare institutions and their employees to report conduct that endangers patients. The supervisor who called 911 was fulfilling that legal obligation. The call was made immediately. There was no attempt to manage the situation internally or to delay the reporting. That immediate report set in motion the police response, the evidence collection, and the legal process that followed. Had the report not been made, or had it been delayed, the camera footage might not have been secured in time, and Sarah's admissions might never have been recorded. The second dimension is the role of hospital surveillance systems. Cameras installed in hallways near nursing stations and in areas adjacent to patient rooms now serve an evidentiary function that goes beyond their original security purpose. In this case, the camera footage was a core component of the case record. Its presence documented the defendant's movements in a way that independent witness testimony alone could not have done. Case 7, Ernesto Barbosa, the evidence that led to this arrest did not come from the facility's security system. It did not come from a staff report. It came from a camera that a daughter had placed in her mother's room because she was worried. That camera was running, and what it captured became the foundation of a criminal prosecution that ended in a guilty plea and a prison sentence. Ernesto Aguilar Barbosa was 57 years old and worked as a caregiver at Brookdale Desert Ridge, a senior living and memory care community in Phoenix, Arizona. The patient at the center of this case was an 88-year-old woman who had been diagnosed with dementia. She was a resident of the memory care unit. On the 26th of July, 2024, the patient's daughter reviewed footage from a motion-activated camera she had installed in her mother's room. The camera captured a male caregiver in circumstances that led the daughter to contact the facility and law enforcement immediately. She brought the footage to the attention of Brookdale's care director. The care director reviewed it and identified Barbosa as the only male employee who had been assigned to that floor during the relevant time period. The daughter then contacted the Phoenix Police Department directly. Phoenix police officers responded to the facility, detectives obtained copies of the camera footage and reviewed it. A forensic nurse examiner was called in to conduct an examination of the patient and to document findings relevant to the investigation. The forensic nurse examiner's documentation was entered into the investigative record as physical evidence. Barbosa was arrested at the scene on the same day the footage was reviewed, the 26th of July, 2024. He was booked into the Maricopa County Jail. The initial charges included sexual assault and kidnapping, both felonies under Arizona law. The case proceeded through the Maricopa County Superior Court system. Barbosa entered a guilty plea to an amended charge of attempt to commit sexual assault. In July of 2025, Judge Suzanne Marwill presided over the sentencing hearing. The court sentenced Barbosa to 2 years in the Arizona Department of Corrections, to be followed by a term of probation. He was ordered to register as a sex offender for the remainder of his life. This case sits at the center of an ongoing policy discussion in Arizona about the rights of families to use independent monitoring technology in the rooms of their relatives in care facilities. The discussion is not hypothetical. It has produced legislative proposals in multiple consecutive sessions of the Arizona legislature. The central question is straightforward. When a patient has a cognitive impairment that prevents them from reporting what happens to them, who holds the accountability function? In this case, the answer was a family member with a camera. The facility's internal systems, staffing records, shift logs, supervisory rounds did not produce the evidence. A daughter's concern did. Advocates for camera rights in care facilities point to this case and cases like it as evidence that families should have a legally protected right to install monitoring devices in their relatives' rooms, free from interference by facility management. Opponents have raised questions about the privacy rights of other residents and staff. The legislative response in Arizona has been active and ongoing, with bills introduced in multiple consecutive sessions. The Barbosa case is cited in those legislative discussions as a documented instance in which a family camera produced evidence that would not otherwise have existed. The forensic nurse examiner component of this investigation is also worth examining. Forensic nurse examiners are registered nurses who have received specialized training in evidence collection, documentation of physical findings, and chain of custody procedures. They are deployed in sexual assault cases to conduct examinations that serve both a medical and a legal purpose. The evidence they document is collected under protocols designed to preserve its admissibility in court. In cases involving patients with dementia or other cognitive impairments who cannot provide verbal accounts, the forensic examination may be the primary source of physical evidence supporting the charge. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. We cover cases like these in depth every episode, and we are just getting started. Case 8, Manuel Corral, an 85-year-old woman living with dementia, reported what had happened. Staff told her son. Her son called the police. A forensic examination was conducted. The caregiver made admissions. And when investigators looked at his employment history, they found that he had been the subject of abuse-related concerns at Mesa care facilities dating back 8 years. Manuel Corral was 58 years old and worked as an overnight caregiver at Heritage Village Assisted Living, located in Mesa, Arizona. Heritage Village served elderly residents, including individuals with significant cognitive impairments. Corral's overnight shift placed him in the facility during the hours when supervisory coverage was at its lowest. In February of 2020, an 85-year-old female resident living with dementia made a report to facility staff that she had been assaulted in her room. The reporting chain proceeded in documented steps. The resident reported to staff. Staff notified her son. Her son reported the matter to the Mesa Police Department. Mesa detectives opened an investigation. A sexual assault nurse examiner was called in to conduct a forensic examination of the resident. The examination produced documentation of physical findings that were consistent with the resident's account. That documentation was entered into the investigative record. It constituted physical corroboration independent of the resident's verbal report. Investigators identified Corral as the only male caregiver assigned to the unit on the relevant shift. He was questioned under advisement of his constitutional rights. During that interview, Corral made admissions to investigators. When detectives reviewed Corral's employment and law enforcement history, they found that he had previously been the subject of concern in abuse-related investigations at other Mesa care facilities. Records indicated a matter from 2012 involving a patient with a brain injury and allegations of physical abuse from 2014. At the time of those earlier matters, no charges had been filed. Following the 2020 arrest and the investigation of the circumstances surrounding it, Prosecutors moved to address the earlier matters as well. Corral was subsequently charged in connection with the 2012 case. The total charging document included 6 counts of sexual assault and 1 count each of kidnapping and sexual abuse, all felony offenses, with an additional sexual assault count relating to the 2012 matter. Mesa Police Department spokesperson Nick Rasheda stated publicly that the investigation indicated Corral had targeted residents who were the most vulnerable, individuals who, because of their cognitive conditions, would not be in a position to disclose what had happened to them. We are careful about the record here. The arrest, the charges, the forensic examination documentation, the admissions, and Corral's prior history at Mesa facilities are all documented in law enforcement records and investigative reporting. The final court disposition of the criminal case was not confirmed in the public record available for this documentary. We present the case at the stage it is verified: arrest, multiple felony charges, and a documented investigative record. The Heritage Village facility did not exist in isolation. It became the subject of a sustained investigative reporting effort by journalists Sahana Gyerman and Caitlin McGlade of the Arizona Republic. Their investigation, conducted over approximately 1 year, documented a broader pattern across Arizona's assisted living industry, an industry that state regulators had for years overseen with limited resources and inconsistent enforcement authority. The reporting they produced described facilities with repeated law enforcement contacts and unresolved abuse complaints, owners who operated multiple facilities under different corporate names, and a regulatory framework that left gaps in the oversight of residential care. That reporting reached the governor's office and the attorney general's office. Governor Katie Hobbs called for a state investigation into Heritage Village. Attorney General Chris Mays petitioned the court for receivership, a legal remedy that places a facility's management under the authority of a court, appointed monitor removing the owner from day-to-day operational control. The Corral case was one data point in a much larger documented record of what was happening to residents at Heritage Village. It became part of the evidentiary basis for a systemic response that went beyond any single criminal prosecution. Case 9, Gamasi Gilles A. family installed a camera in their mother's room because they were concerned about her care. The camera recorded what happened. The family contacted police. The caregiver was arrested, and within days, a bill that had been stalled in the Arizona legislature for 2 consecutive sessions was moving again. Gamasi Gilles was 46 years old and worked as a caregiver at Grand Court Senior Living, an assisted living facility located near Mesa Drive and Brown Road in Mesa, Arizona. The patient at the center of this case was a woman living with dementia who was wheelchair dependent. According to the Mesa Police Department, the case came to the attention of law enforcement when the patient's daughter contacted police after reviewing videos she had recorded using a camera she had installed in her mother's room. The recording showed Gilles in the patient's room engaging in contact that the daughter reported as offensive. The patient, according to police, attempted to move away in her wheelchair during the interaction. On the 19th of April, 2026, Mesa police arrested Gilles. He was booked into the Maricopa County Jail on 3 charges: 1 count of felony sexual abuse, 1 count of felony abuse of a vulnerable adult, and 1 count of misdemeanor assault. At his initial court appearance, a judge set bond at $50,000. When questioned by police, Gilles denied the allegations. We report this case precisely as the legal record requires. Gilles has been charged. He has not been convicted. He has not entered a guilty plea. No sentence has been imposed. The defendant is presumed innocent under Arizona and United States law. We present the charges and the factual basis for the investigation as documented by law enforcement and court records. The policy consequence of this arrest moved faster than the criminal case itself. Senate Bill 1041, introduced in the Arizona legislature by Representative Quang Nguyen of Prescott Valley, addresses a specific and well-defined question. Can an assisted living facility prohibit a family from installing a monitoring camera in a resident's room? The bill would make such prohibitions unlawful. It would give families a legally protected right to place cameras in their relatives' rooms, provided certain notification requirements are met. Representative Nguyen had introduced versions of this legislation in 2 prior consecutive sessions. In the previous session, the House of Representatives had passed the bill, but it was never scheduled for a hearing in the Senate. It died without a vote. Following the arrest of Gilles on the 19th of April 2026, the bill gained renewed attention. On the 22nd of April, 3 days after the arrest, the Arizona House of Representatives passed Senate Bill 1041 by a bipartisan vote of 41-11 and sent it to the state Senate. Dana Marie Kennedy, the state director of ARP Arizona, addressed the legislation and its context. She stated that the situation was something that had to stop, that families trusted these facilities to care for their loved ones, and the fact that someone in a position of trust could harm a resident was not acceptable. This case, and the legislation it accelerated, reflect a pattern that appears across several cases in this documentary. A documented incident involving a vulnerable patient, a family member who used available technology to create an evidentiary record, and a legislative response that had been debated in theory but moved to action when connected to a specific documented event. The camera in the room was not a facility system. It was not placed by a regulator. It was placed by a daughter, and it recorded what happened. Case 10, Rita Anago. She was not in a hospital room. She was not a floor nurse. She was a nurse practitioner who owned a clinic. And according to prosecutors, her clinic billed Arizona's Medicaid program for services provided to people who were incarcerated, to people who had died, and to children who had never been seen. The investigation that followed involved an outside audit, coordinated state and federal prosecution, and a result that sent billing in the targeted program down by 92%. Rita Anago was a nurse practitioner who lived and worked in the Santan Valley area of Maricopa County, Arizona. She held an advanced practice nursing credential and owned and operated Tusa Integrated Clinic, an outpatient behavioral health and addiction treatment facility. The clinic was enrolled as a healthcare provider with the Arizona Healthcare Cost Containment System, the state Medicaid program known as HCCs. Anago also served, according to prosecutors, as the behavioral health professional of record for as many as 10 to 15 additional facilities. The scheme, as set out in the state and federal criminal proceedings, was one of systematic billing fraud. Tusa Integrated Clinic submitted claims to HCCs for behavioral health services that had not been provided. Prosecutors documented specific categories of fraudulent claims. Claims for services billed on behalf of children who had never received any care from the facility, claims for individuals who were incarcerated at the time the services were allegedly rendered, and claims for HCC's members who had died before the service dates listed on the billing records. Each of those categories represents a billing submission that could have been detected through cross-reference with publicly maintained records, incarceration databases, mortality records, and age eligibility records. Prosecutors also alleged that Anago used her position as a behavioral health professional to pressure AHCCC's members into switching their health plan enrollment. The mechanism for that pressure, according to the charging documents, was the threat of removal from housing. Prosecutors alleged that the sober living homes from which residents were threatened with removal were not licensed facilities operating under legitimate residential care standards, but were instead part of the same network of fraudulent operations. Federal court documents associated with the prosecution described the total value of the fraudulent claims in the tens of millions of dollars. Prosecutors stated that after Anago received a subpoena for clinic records, she instructed former employees to create therapy notes, written documentation of treatment sessions, for sessions that had never taken place. The fabrication of records in response to a legal process is an obstruction-related offense distinct from the underlying billing fraud. The patients at the center of this case were, in significant numbers, Native American individuals who had been recruited with the expectation of receiving addiction treatment services. Some had been placed in sober living arrangements as part of what they understood to be a treatment program. Investigators found that patients who believed they were receiving legitimate care had instead been used as billing instruments. When the scheme collapsed, some of those individuals returned to substance use. The investigation was part of a coordinated enforcement effort that Arizona state government launched in 2023. Governor Katie Hobbs and Attorney General Chris Mays jointly announced that fraudulent behavioral health and sober living providers had been exploiting Native American and tribal community members at scale. The response included an outside audit of HCCC's behavioral health billing going back to 2019. That audit identified the scope of the fraud and the identities of providers involved. The prosecution of Anago combined state and federal proceedings. The Attorney General's office brought state charges. A separate federal indictment addressed the federal Medicaid fraud dimensions of the scheme. Anago pleaded guilty to the charges brought by the state. On the 6th of May, 2026, she was sentenced in Maricopa County Superior Court to 3.5 years in the Arizona Department of Corrections. Her nursing license had been revoked the prior year. In the federal proceeding, she was ordered to pay $55 million in restitution and was awaiting federal sentencing at the time this documentary was produced. Attorney General Mays, addressing the outcome publicly, stated that prosecuting those who stole from Arizona's Medicaid system while exploiting vulnerable residents had been a top priority of the office. The billing data tells the story of the enforcement effort's impact in quantifiable terms. CC's is American Indian Health Plan Behavioral Health Billing. Across 2021 through 2023 totaled approximately $3.1 billion. Across 2024 through 2026, the same billing totaled approximately $229.9 million. That is a reduction of approximately 92%. Attorney General Mays stated publicly that the billing programs targeted by the enforcement effort had dropped by 92% since the crackdown began, and that the office was not finished. Since 2023, the Attorney General's office reported indicting 140 people and business entities connected to the fraud schemes. Of those, 89 had pleaded guilty, been sentenced, or reached court-approved settlements. 41 convictions had been secured. The office also reported recovering or seizing more than $139 million in cash and real property. AHCCC's implemented additional safeguards against fraudulent billing claims as part of the administrative response to the investigation. This case closes our documentary with a different kind of accounting. The patients were not harmed in a room with a single caregiver on a single night. They were harmed across a network, over years, by a systematic misuse of a public health care program designed to serve them. The investigation that addressed it was not conducted by a single detective. It was a coordinated, multi-agency, multi-year effort. And the evidence was not found on a camera or in a DNA profile. It was found in billing records, in dates, and in names, the names of people who could not have been in a clinic on a day when someone claimed they were.